one another a little bit. Before I turn it over to my colleagues, Gwen Callender and Bob Sauter, to kick off today's presentation, I want to personally thank Jason Pappas from the FOP and Zach Klein, Columbus City Attorney, for being with us today to talk about the issue of policing, particularly in Columbus, but I think that'll probably tie into a national conversation that's happening about that issue as well. Looking ahead, our next COLERA luncheon, virtual luncheon, is scheduled for Tuesday, December 15th. That will be our post-election analysis discussion. We will have, I think we have a pretty good sense of the election results now, but we'll be joined that day by Herb Asher from Ohio State and Terry Casey, well-known Republican consultant here in Central Ohio, who will kind of give us the breakdown on what happened in this election, what we should anticipate as the results going into next year, what that means legislatively and politically in the state, but also in particular with an eye on what that means for labor and employment relations here in Central Ohio. So that is December 15th. And again, we'll continue to look for your emails and our website for updates on upcoming programs after that third Tuesday in January, February, March, April, and May as well. So let me turn to Bob and Gwen. And I don't know, I guess I'll turn to Gwen first. So Gwen Callender is on the COLERA board, and Gwen is coordinating today's presentation with Bob Sauter. I'll turn it over to the two of you.
Can you close my door? Hi everybody. Sorry about that, I'm at the office. And so I'm happy to introduce Jason Pappas, and then I'll turn it over to Bob and he can introduce Zach Klein. I've worked with Jason for a long time. Jason is a Columbus police officer, and he also serves as vice president of the state FOP Lodge, and he's the past president of Capital City Lodge 9 here in Columbus, where he served as president for 6 years. He's held a variety of positions with the state lodge, and he's also a registered lobbyist on our legislative committee. So he has spent some time at the State House, and he's testified on numerous bills. Jason has negotiated dozens of collective bargaining agreements for Lodge 9. He's been a team member for multiple contracts. He began his career with Columbus in 1991, actually the same year I started here at the state FOP Lodge. He has held positions of patrol officer, homicide, assault squad, the sexual abuse unit, fraud unit, and a street crime attack team. While he was president of Lodge 9, Jason was also involved in several initiatives, one being the implementation of body-worn cameras. He's also been involved with implementing new minority recruitment strategies as well. He's born and raised in Dayton, Ohio. He's been married to Julie for 27 years, and he has 2 adult children. So I'm really glad Jason is here today because he has, obviously had extensive experience as a police officer on that side, but also as well negotiating contracts and being a lobbyist at the State House. So he's well versed in the issues that are facing police today and the future of policing in Columbus. So I think that's a good segue to turn it over to Bob to introduce Zach Klein, who is also part of this discussion today. So Bob.
Thank you, Gwen. I am happy that we have 2 speakers who talk to each other on a regular basis, who like each other, and I think will really be fun to listen to on a really serious topic. Zach, I could probably tell you, does know who the next president is, having served for Vice President Joe Biden as his deputy director of management and administration. while Joe was the vice president. Zach is through and through an Ohio guy, grew up in Belpre, Ohio, and graduated from The Ohio State University and Capital University Law School. Zach's time with the city encompasses service on city council from 2011 through 2017, including 2 years serving as the city council president. Since January of 2018, Zach has been our city attorney and has been very involved in looking at policy and legal issues, and especially this year as the impact of the Black Lives Matter movement has come full circle and presented itself with a lot of vigor in Columbus. So I like Gwen, I think we're excited that both Jason and Zach will be speaking to us today, and I am sure that they both will welcome questions and comments from the audience.
I'm not really sure at what the agenda was as far as what Scott wanted to do, but I know that Bob and I came up with some prompts. But I don't know if Jason, if you want to kind of give a little bit of a brief, introduction or anything you want to say first, and then we could turn over to Zach. And then Bob and I have some questions to prompt some discussion.
Sure, I'd be happy to. First, I'd like to thank COLERA for the opportunity to speak today on a very important topic, which is the future of policing. I also want to thank Columbus City Attorney Zach Klein for his willingness to be part of this discussion and providing his insight into the future of policing, and particularly for Zach for here in the city of Columbus. But I do want to be very clear about something, and that is, while I'm happy to be here to address this body, I need to clarify one point, and that is that I am here in my capacity as Vice President of the Ohio FOP. I'm not speaking for the Columbus Division of Police, the City of Columbus, or FOP Capital City Lodge Number 9. My remarks and my beliefs are my own, and they may not necessarily reflect the opinions of those other entities. Having said that, you've seen my bio, and I'm happy to get right into today's discussions.
I would just kind of build off something that Jason said, and thanks, Bob, for the introduction, and Gwen. In the interest of full disclosure, and Bob alluded to this, I consider Jason a friend. He's someone that I've gotten to know really well over the past couple of years, starting as my time as the safety chair on the city council and as council president and even as city attorney, that frankly, I turn to with questions that we can have honest dialogues about without having foregone conclusions. So I appreciate everything that Jason does, and I just want the group to know that I do consider him a friend. And secondarily, just to specifically build off what Jason said, I think it's important. This conversation is extremely important, but it's also important in the context that there are a lot of voices out there that weigh in on this topic, and rightfully so, and that Jason and I are two voices that don't want to minimize our importance, because I think we are important voices, but there's also community groups, there's also Lodge 9, there's the administration, there's council, there's faith leaders, others that have really important opinions and things to say about the future of policing. So I think it's really making sure as we kind of go through this conversation, the context of we are just one, but kind of two people who have a broad view and opinion on the future of policing, not just in Columbus, but in the United States.
Great. Bob, do you want to start off with the questions, or do you want me to?
Oh, well, I have one, I think it's an important kind of question, and that's the perception that's out there. And I want to say to each of you, is the perception that cops are bad, that they're violent, that they're racist? Is that a fair perception, or is it overblown? And given that the perception is out there, what steps can be taken to change that perception?
I think that it's an unfair perception. I think police overall are great people. They have tough jobs. And, I am concerned that this us versus them mentality that has bred into our body politic has bred into policing. That doesn't mean, in my opinion, that there isn't need for reform. But I don't think that we should ever paint with a broad brush that, all police officers commit excessive uses of force or all police officers are racist, because I reject that premise. And I also accept the premise that we need to work together to improve policing in the same way that we should be improving, many aspects of government outside of policing, and that the context of improving policing is no different than us trying to strive to be better generally in society and government. Police are just not immune to that. We can improve in many aspects.
I concur with Zach's sentiments. I acknowledge that there are some bad police officers in this world, just as there are bad attorneys and teachers and doctors and all the above. No profession is immune from having a bad actor within their ranks. The question is, how do we address those issues? And I think there's really two fronts. One is that we try to do a much better job on the front end during the hiring process as we go through and make sure that the applicants that make it through the process are worthy to be held to that higher standard and fulfill it. And then on the back end, and that is once they are hired, if there is misconduct, that we aggressively address it and or weed it out, depending on what the misconduct is. And so I would say that we have robust procedures. I can't speak so much on the hiring side because we're not part of that, but on the application of discipline, I can tell you that in my tenure and my time on the Division of Police, we have terminated the employment of dozens of officers who did not deserve to be here, and that's okay by us. We don't want them here either.
Your statements both have prompted some questions, and I think, Jason, you hit on this a little bit, but the perception out there, I think, from what I've seen this year, is that the police unions protect the bad cops, that they aren't doing what you're alluding to, which is, weeding out folks that maybe aren't cut out for the type of work that is involved with policing. And can you respond to that? And Zach as well, from a management perspective, what is it? Do the unions protect bad cops? And what is your obligation under the state law in Ohio, Chapter 4117, when it comes to representing police officers?
Okay, wow. So there's a lot to unpack in those questions. Those should be broken down in about 3 categories, Gwen, but let me try to recall some of those and hit on them. So first and foremost, some of the things that we talk about, police union protecting bad officers. I can rattle off a litany of officers who have been terminated for misconduct, as I said earlier, who deserve to be terminated for their misconduct. We don't tolerate it. We do have a process in place where we do require the hiring agency, in this particular context, the City of Columbus, to follow rules that were agreed to. And as long as that's done and the process is fair, then the outcome is what the outcome is. Some of the things that really become aggravating, and I think it's for both sides, I want to make sure I'm clear here, and that is misunderstanding. And what I mean by that is we often will see a snippet of a video clip on the news or some sort of incident that occurred with a police officer. And so you'll have some, community outcry about, holding a police accountable or something along those lines, or a group of people will have an opinion about an incident without knowing the full context. An investigation will be done. Maybe it's something that's presented to the grand jury. And at the end of the day, the officer is cleared of wrongdoing. And so going in, the expectation is, well, I saw this little video clip, 2 or 3 seconds on the news and it looked really bad. now that officer is cleared of misconduct down the road. How can that be? And so there's this confusion and misunderstanding, which creates mistrust of the process. And I do believe that there are things that could be done better as far as communication within the community, and to make sure that those miscommunications or misperceptions do not permeate. But those are problematic. I will share a story. Just recently, I know of someone who was elected to office made a inaccurate statement the other day about something that the police union was involved in, and that is the kind of thing that we can't have our leaders do. And so while that issue has been addressed, once it's done, the damage is done, and there's no way to go back and undo that damage. One other thing that really kind of has exacerbated some of the issue is the use of social media. Things go viral now in a matter of seconds, and something will get posted, and there's no way for the division to know where all of those outlets are, or whether it was done on Parler or Instagram or Facebook or wherever. And so the division may have a press conference or may put out a press release, but it's probably not going to go to all the different areas where the misinformation is spreading, or even where good information is spreading, but the division can't respond to it all in a timely manner. And so all of those little nuances really have an impact on public perception. And some of it's just weakness that I'm not sure how to overcome in the digital world, but we're adapting and growing, and we'll continue to do so.
I want to say that, first of all, like I'm pro-union and I'm pro-collective bargaining. And that means, working within the collective bargaining process to ensure there's accountability. And that's something that I think the city of Columbus and its current negotiations with all its unions, not just the FOP, but because we're talking about policing, specifically referring to the FOP, it's like making sure that we can have accountability, not only within the city, what the city wants, but with the people that we represent. And I think that sometimes the challenge in the community is understanding like how we cannot get more accountability for what can be perceived as excessive use of force, for example. That is always backdropped against the constitutional standards created by the United States Supreme Court. And that sometimes I think is a challenge for people to appreciate or understand, because the Supreme Court is something that a lot of people don't spend time reading case law about. But police officers, whether it's a search warrant or whether it's a use of force, like all of those are essentially defined by what the United States Supreme Court has granted officers to do. And people may have legitimate disagreements on whether that gives too much discretion to police officers. And that's a fair conversation to have. But you still are bound by Supreme Court precedent. And I think that poses a really interesting question, and one that I've had internally and with folks in the Division of Police is, the difference between what is legally justified can be different than what our community expects. So you may be absolved, for example, if you get sued for a Section 1983 claim. So if you're not familiar with that, that's basically a government official acting in their official capacity and overstepping their bounds from a constitutional standpoint. Someone can sue the city of Columbus or sue the officers or the police chief, and those are called Section 1983 claims. The city of Columbus gets sued quite frequently in Section 1983 claims. You can win a 1983 case because the officer may have acted within his or her constitutional authority. That's still a different analysis of whether that is an authority we want to grant an officer. And those are, I think, fair discussions as we think about policing and the future of policing. Is we can't go past the constitutional standard, but we can fall shy of the constitutional standard, if that makes sense. So we can put more stringent, safeguards around police conduct set by policy, but that doesn't mean necessarily that an officer would violate the law per se because of what the Constitution has said. And I think that's something kind of, and Jason mentioned kind of grand jury. That's something interesting in grand jury is, for one, there's a lack of transparency in the grand jury process. It's secretive. A lot of folks don't, it's one-sided. And folks don't know or trust the grand jury process necessarily all the time, to think that a fair shake is given to the victim in the case or the person who force was used against, because those transcripts are typically sealed and secretive. So like opening up a grand jury process so that the public knows what was presented is something, is just one example of something that I think is worthy of discussion as it relates to transparency on excessive use of force cases.
Some of what you both have said has prompted me to ask a couple of more follow-up questions. Zach, you had mentioned kind of in your opening that there is a need for reform. There is a need for improved policing. And I'm wondering what does that look like? I mean, and this topic is the future of policing. Do you have any specifics when it comes to reform? I know that in Columbus, we just passed the creation of a civilian review board. So I don't know if you want to address that as well. Is that the solution? And if so, how? But what is the reform have you thought about that? What does that look like? And I would ask Jason to follow up the same question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really the $1 million question that I think cities across the country and government entities across the country are facing. So I'll kind of mention specifically as a result of the protests this summer, and then I'll kind of give a broader kind of general sense, if that's okay, Gwen. So in response to the protests this summer, folks may have known or saw that I came out with my own sort of set of reforms that I thought in response to the protests, the city of Columbus needed to do. And they were broken down essentially into two buckets. They were a response to the protests themselves, the things that we saw on TV, things that we saw on social media. And then the second bucket was, a response to the underlying reasons why people were protesting. So as it relates to the protest itself, it was, for example, right now, Carter Stewart, the former United States Attorney for the Southern District of Ohio, in conjunction with the Ohio State University, are doing an after-action audit of the way the city of Columbus, including the Division of Police, but the city of Columbus handled the protests. I think we got several things right, and I think we got some things wrong, and we can improve. And protests aren't going anywhere, and I think it's incumbent upon us as city leaders, and our citizens expect it for us to have the best response, a best practiced response in the way that the city of Columbus and Division of Police handle protests. It also included a change in how it advocated a change of how we use and deploy tear gas as it relates to First Amendment activities or to move crowds, and differentiating that between how we use pepper spray as well. And so like those were kind of the reforms as it related to protesting. And then of course, remembering the underlying reasons why people protesting. One of the things that I announced was a support, as you mentioned, Gwen, for the Civilian Review Board that the voters just passed. In addition, bringing charging decisions in-house, which is something that was recently talked about in the news for our prosecutors to review case files from police to decide what charges are filed. And so like that was more in response to the protests themselves, or to the underlying reasons why people protest. So there's like specific examples based on an incident of how we can reform and rethink policing. So looking at it holistically, however, not to oversimplify it, but when I think of reimagining or rethinking policing, I kind of think of, a job description. And you start with, what role do we think police should play in our community in November of 2020? And maybe you have a list of 15 things or 20 things. And then you compare that to, what role do police play in our society? And that list may be 50 or 60 things. And I think, when you look at the differences between those lists, we've asked police and frankly, the criminal justice system as a whole to address a lot of issues that really have to do with poverty, that have to do with mental health, that have to do with addiction, that, frankly, police officers probably don't sign up and become eager to be police officers to tackle. But we've asked the criminal justice system to handle them for us. And that, in that delta, that difference between, sorry, that's my phone ringing to my computer. That delta of, the 10 or 15 things, for example, we want police to do And the difference between the 40 and 50 that we currently ask them to do, that to me is the opportunity for change. That to me is the opportunity to rethink how police play the role in dealing with homelessness, in dealing with mental health, in dealing with traffic, in dealing with accidents. Like all of that, I think can be safely on the table to have a fair discussion. Doesn't mean necessarily that you move towards that, but you can have a fair and honest discussion about how you rethink and reshape policing. That does not mean defund the police. I think that is a silly, stupid idea, something that I'm not ever in favor of. We need police. They have an important role to play in our society, but we may need them to play a different role when it comes to dealing with someone who just overdosed on heroin or fentanyl. And it's like rethinking that, I think, is the opportunity for us to change policing in the future.
Well, how does the Civilian Review Board play into that?
So the Civilian Review Board has to do more with accountability and oversight than it does with the role a police officer plays in our community. So the Civilian Review Board, which my office helped draft the language that ultimately ended up being passed overwhelmingly by the citizens, it creates a Civilian Review Board structure that fits and is conducive to the current FOP contract, because we are very, and rightfully so, protecting collective bargaining rights, wanted to have a review board structure that did not run afoul of collective bargaining rights. So what was passed is the basis that once the city, which is currently within negotiations with the FOP as we speak, as the city is able to get concessions with the FOP, whatever those concessions are, depending on how the collective bargaining process plays out, we're able to add to the base of the Civilian Review Board that was passed to the voters. So the Civilian Review Board now, there's a Civilian Review Board working group of exactly how, the structure, how many people, where they're going to come from, how they're appointed, those sort of questions that are going to be answered. But the authority of the Civilian Review Board is authority that's currently allowed and permitted by the FOP contract. It does create an inspector general. It does allow for require for the production of documents so that the Civilian Review Board can review what those documents are and review the evidence that are, by the way, most of the time public record anyway, that are able to then formulate opinions and recommendations as it relates to officer misconduct, but also provide and be a listening ear to the community as far as what, how training should take place for the chief, or things that the chief should consider as well. So I think it plays dual roles. And like I said, it is a base for which us as a city can build upon as we move forward and under the rules of collective bargaining, which I think we all agree are important rules for all, public sector unions.
I'd like to add a couple of points, and the first one would be, Zach, you owe $10 to the charity of your choice for the interruption of the phone call during the meeting. It's a standing rule we have, so you're now bound to it.
I'll let you pick, Jason.
But Zach has a lot of great points, and when we talk about change, I can tell you that in my 30 years here, not one division directive that guides our actions is the same as the day that I started. We constantly are reviewing the things that we do in law enforcement in general, but specifically in Columbus. And we are constantly changing and adapting to both societal norms, expectations, and technology and other training things that are available to us. And so I know Zach hit on one of the responses to the protests downtown and the use of tear gas and chemical agents. That came to light fairly early that was upsetting to some people. Immediately the division instituted a couple of rule changes and then sought to address the issue in a different manner. And I know that they're now training what's called the PERT team. It's the police emergency response team that has a very small group of people who would be able to penetrate those kind of groups. So, when issues are brought to our attention, we're not afraid to change in law enforcement. We constantly embrace change. One of the other topics Zach talked about was the scope. Things are much different today than when I started law enforcement 30 years ago. Having to train every new officer as a CIT officer is really important today because mental health, I believe at the state level, has been dropped significantly and is a major problem now for every community in Ohio. And so, someone has to be the first responder to those incidences, and it's law enforcement. And so we have adapted training, and all that training takes time and effort and resources and response away from the community unless we backfill them. And so, there's a ton of things to consider when we talk about what to address. Fentanyl and overdose is another one, where we now carry Narcan in our cars, which in the past we didn't do, and defibrillators and different kinds of weapons and things that we need to respond to all the different things that are brought our way in law enforcement every day. So it's a constant evolving, constant changing, always improving process, and law enforcement across Ohio is happy to embrace those changes. And if I could add one other piece with that, and that is, it's just not what we think locally. There are accrediting agencies, specifically one big one called COLERA, that most law enforcement strive to be part of. And, that's a full-time commitment. And all of our policies are reviewed, and not just by the community that we serve, but also by the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, the National Sheriff's Association, the Police Executive Research Forum. And on that board, I think it's a 21-member board, and they have teachers, educators, lawyers. I think there are 2 retired judges, and I think a professor from Southern Illinois. So, it's a broad base of people who review our policies and make sure that we're staying most up to date and accredited at the highest level that we can possibly be accredited.
Jason, do you have any thoughts on the Civilian Review Board that was just passed by the voters in Columbus, and what, from your perspective, what role that may or may not play in the future of policing here in Columbus?
Well, so let me say this. As I said earlier, I'm not here to speak for Lodge 9. I think Zach summed it up fairly well. It's a base, and then whatever happens in negotiations will determine, where we go from there. I will say, just like everything else, I think of major cities, I think 125 of the major cities across the country have some sort of civilian oversight, either an office of the inspector general or a civilian review board, or, there are different kinds. And it's not, I just want to be cautious what I say here. It's not that there will be a review board. It's oversight functions and the process. So what are they going to do and how are they going to do it? And once we get beyond that, I think the rest of it will just kind of fall into place, like Zach said.
I have, as you both touched on, officer misconduct. Under the current system, we have arbitrators who make binding and final decisions on discipline. And as COLERA does include neutrals in its membership, I think that the whole area of officer discipline is of interest. How do you each view the arbitration process? What's happening now? Could there be improvements that could be made? There, for instance, had been suggestions that perhaps for police officer cases, there be a process of appointing common pleas court judges to decide officer discipline cases. And again, often this concern seems to come from the perception that the FOP wins all of the arbitration cases and the city loses them all. So I'd like your sort of to this labor management group, sort of like your thoughts on arbitration and officer discipline.
Well, as a representative of the city, I don't want to say that we lose them all.
I concur, by the way, he doesn't. They do not.
Yeah. I look, Bob, I think that the underlying theme of your question is important and one that I embrace, and that is, are there different ways that promote accountability and transparency in how we deal with officer discipline? I'm not wed to a particular way, but I am open to the ideas, like one that you suggested was the common pleas court judge. I'm not suggesting that is the right answer, but I think it's an interesting one to discuss and to have, a conversation with legislators, with the FOP, with elected officials, and whether that's an appropriate forum for, appealability on dealing with officer discipline, mainly because, a common pleas court judge in Ohio, at least, is independently elected, and there's some accountability versus an arbitrator that no one's ever heard of, and that person's binding arbitration is his or her final word on the subject. So the more, I think, accountability we can build into the system, and I don't necessarily mean that as accountability just for police officers, but accountability on the process itself, I think doesn't hurt.
I would, one of the things that I would say is, first, I truly respect the job that our third-party neutrals do. Obviously, we have across the state, some places have panels where we draw from the same people to hear our cases, and those third parties are often intimately aware of the culture and the issues within the agencies when it comes to, I think specifically you're talking about here on discipline, but there's also assignment and transfer issues and contract language and other things that come up. And so having that expertise is very important. But even for those entities that we have where we don't have panels and we just randomly select, or, they're pooled, I would say the vast majority of the time they get it right. Occasionally, I think, I don't see it that way, but that's okay. I think the process is fair. I think it's efficient. And I think it's a good system that we have. I would fear greatly that if we went to, like a common pleas review, first of all, I'm not sure the court wants that many cases added to their dockets and that additional responsibility. But I also know that court cases can take a very long period of time, stretched out, sometimes for years to get a resolution on a case. And I don't think that's fair and efficient for either party. And so I respect the process that we use now. If it changes, then we'll adapt. But I like the system that we have in place.
And can I maybe lead into that another area that, for instance, in Ohio, the teachers have certainly seen and had to deal with, and that is the area of licensure. Officers currently have state license, but little state oversight. Should there be a state agency with powers to enact and enforce a code of conduct for police officers statewide, and have the power to either suspend or revoke licensure, much like is done for teachers today in Ohio?
Do you mind if I take first crack at that, Zach?
Go for it.
So there are discussions now happening about that exact thing. We have been engaged in conversation with both the Attorney General's office and the Governor's office, and I suspect that I doubt it'll happen in this lame duck session of the General Assembly, but more than likely you will see the introduction of a House bill next year. And I think that is one of the issues that will be introduced into the General Assembly for consideration. There are obviously different things to address. We have seen outlines. There are concerns with some of them, but generally speaking, it gets back to the same conversation that we had earlier about review boards, and that is, as long as the system is fair and the processes are fair, then so be it. If that's what we end up with, that's fine.
Can I ask, and before Zach answers, Jason, is it important that police officers be part of the process to actually review other officers, or would you be satisfied with a system that is in place today for teachers in Ohio, where the investigation process and the determination process does not necessarily involve any teachers making licensure decisions?
Well, I can't say that I'm thoroughly familiar with the teacher system. That would because I am not familiar. What I can tell you is, looking at some of the other boards in the revised code, most of them have the composition of the people doing the job. Nurses reviewing nurses, doctors reviewing doctors, attorneys reviewing attorneys. So in that context, I would say, yes, it's absolutely important that law enforcement be part of that panel, the same way that those other boards are. The other thing is, it would be somewhat difficult for people who do not have any kind of law enforcement background to understand the complexities, or maybe case law or Graham versus Connor, or any of the other important decisions, Pennsylvania versus Mims, or whatever it took for to understand what was happening. So yeah, at the end of the day, I do believe that it is important for law enforcement to have a very active role in any kind of oversight board.
And I'll agree with Jason here, that I do think that law enforcement should have a seat at the table. I don't think that they should have all the seats. I think the unique role that policing plays in their ability to effectuate arrests, to use force, and the special authorities that are granted to them also require, some level of civilian oversight, but it also shouldn't be solely civilian. And I do think that there are significant complexities as it deals with policing and responding to situations. And so having a process that includes disparate voices ranging from citizenry to experts to police would be important if we went down that route. I'm not privy to those legislative conversations, so I don't know exactly what's planning on being introduced. But generally speaking, I would think that you would want a whole host of voices at that table.
I've got another question. If Gwen, if it's okay. We have seen that the city apparently is taking steps within its budgetary process to take out civilian positions from control of the command structure in the Division of Police, and to move these positions to the Department of Public Safety. Specifically, there's been discussion about doing that with dispatchers and also with a number of civilian positions that are currently housed within the Division of Police, dealing with things like budget and financial controls. Does that make sense? Does that make sense in the context of taking of restoring power to where it should be placed, or is that a slap at the uniformed service?
Well, I think it could make sense. I don't think that any action should be taken just for the sake of taking it. I think if it makes sense from a budgetary standpoint and from a process standpoint, it very well could be the right move. As city attorney, I've removed myself from the direct involvement in the budget process. No longer on council, no longer the council president. So I don't have like that voting voice like I did when we approved previous budgets and working with the mayor's office. But these sort of discussions that need to take place with the division, the chief, the Department of Public Safety. And, and I also believe having the FOP Lodge 9 at the table are important ones as, again, we rethink the way that we want policing from soup to nuts to act in the city of Columbus. And I think that's even more true given tighter budgets that we're all going to face because of COVID and declining, income tax revenues. So like there are just real practical realities in dealing with this as well.
Yeah, I know we've been talking quite a bit about the hot button topics, that kind of permeate our society today. But Zach just hit on something that's going to be very, very important, especially to Ohio's big cities very soon, and that is tax collection or revenue for the cities in a post-COVID world with working from home in remote locations. In particular, I know there's a challenge to the current emergency declaration by the governor that essentially allows for the continuation of income tax collection from people working from home. I suspect that that's going to be challenged constitutionally this year and next in the legislature. If it doesn't get addressed in lame duck, I'm sure it'll get addressed next year.
We actually have an active lawsuit now, Jason. The city of Columbus has been sued.
Okay, there you go. And so I suspect that that's going to be a very challenging case. And if whoever, I don't know who filed the suit, but if they were to prevail, you talk about a seismic shift in the income tax and the impact on public safety. That's one that will do it. That is going to really affect major cities in Ohio. And so, just that, and we'll have to talk about technology and implementation of other, tech industry items into law enforcement to cover some of those gaps. So a lot of, in the future, policing in Ohio and across the country is going to be very challenging after COVID.
Do you each see if Joe Biden, let me say, when Joe Biden is sworn in as president, do you see a change in how the Department of Justice, the Federal Department of Justice, may interact with police agencies, especially in areas that touch on alleged police misconduct?
I'll start and I'll say to some degree, yes. Again, I want to go back and say that, a vast majority of the work that is done in law enforcement every day is done very well. But I'm also not afraid to say, like I did earlier, that law enforcement has some bad apples in it. I will also say that there are some agencies across the country that probably could have better leadership. I know that in previous administrations, the use of consent decrees was a little more, I don't want to say liberal because there weren't that many in the first place, but they were, there were consent decrees that were negotiated with different entities. And sometimes, a review is not a bad thing, because oftentimes you'll find that officers need more training, they need more funding, or they need more resources to do the jobs that we've been asked to do. So I just want to make it clear that even if the DOJ has a different approach, doesn't make it a negative. It just means it's a different approach, and we'll work through them just like we have in the past with other Department of Justice administrations.
I mean, I agree with what Jason said. I mean, when you look at the Trump administration's approach, it's so laissez-faire on this issue. So by definition, if the Biden administration does one thing, they're doing more than the status quo. So I guess by definition, what Jason is saying, that you'll probably see a Biden Justice Department be actively involved, but the active level is all going to be relative to the no involvement the Trump administration plays on these important issues and how they affect citizenry.
Oftentimes, Bob, we'll have, funding tied to some sort of, rule, DOJ related, or Congress will, enact some sort of rule that, we have to do this, that, or the other to get funding of some way, or, through grants. The Department of Justice and, quite frankly, the federal government for a long period of time has had rules in place that have impacted the way that we do business. There might be more sometime, there might be less sometime, but the federal government has played a role in local and state law enforcement for quite some time, and it'll continue to be that way for some time.
I think also, Gwen, we should say if any of the participants have questions too. We don't want to necessarily dominate the questioning.
I think Scott has one.
I do have one, Bob.
Good.
And I imagine there probably will be some others, but I guess I wanted to ask a bigger picture question, and that's on the issue of systemic racism, because I know that was part of the setup for this whole thing. It was interesting watching, tracking kind of from the death of George Floyd to the protests that erupted afterwards, and then kind of the political polarization that seemed to happen following that. You could almost find that there was, as some neighborhoods had a lot of Black Lives Matter signs, you had others where there's Blue Lives Matter, and there was almost this dichotomy and this tension where you're either for addressing racism and standing up for Black lives, or you're for defending the police. And I think that bore out in presidential politics, partisan politics in the election. I guess I want to ask Jason first, but hear from both of you. What is the answer in terms of the state of systemic racism in our society, and how does it show up in policing, and how should we address it? And is it an either or question? Is it Black lives or Blue lives, or is there a way to come together on this now that we're past the election?
Okay, well, let me start by saying, I believe that you can support the police and still demand accountability. We've had, issues from the beginning of my career, where, I think back in the 90s after the Rodney King riots, after the verdicts of the officers came out, and we had some riots, and we had issues, and in the 90s, I can't remember the term exactly, but racial profiling was a big issue back in the 90s, and there was a demand for accountability by putting dash cams in our cruisers to make sure things were on the up and up, and we instituted dash cams, and we just went about our business doing the same thing that we always did, because I believe that the vast majority of officers do the right way, the right time, for the right reasons, and it didn't have an impact on law enforcement in the way that I thought a lot of people think it would. And so then there was a demand that we collect statistics, and so we started collecting statistics, and now after that, then it went to body cameras, and people demanded body cameras to show that we were doing things wrong, and quite frankly, that didn't happen either. And so I think people are okay to demand accountability from law enforcement. We serve the people, and it's okay to have oversight. We're not afraid of oversight in law enforcement. As I've said, I think twice already, as long as we have a fair process, and we'll be fine, because our guys are doing the right things the right way at the right time. As far as protecting Black lives, I'm going to tell you that our guys go out, our guys and gals, every day in the inner city, the suburbs, it doesn't matter where they are. Nobody fights harder to protect lives than the law enforcement officers out there every day and every night. Inner city particularly. Most of the people who work in most of the officers that work in those inner city environments volunteer to be there. They care deeply about the community. They develop deep relationships within the community. You'll see that, several charity things have popped up as a result. In Columbus in particular, you have the Cops and Barbers campaign, and the Back to School, and the Starfish assignment. And for those who are not from Columbus, sorry if I lost you a little bit there, but those all were organic and developed in our inner city neighborhoods from the officers being engaged and participating daily in the lives of the people in our inner cities. Again, I believe that people can support the police and still demand accountability, and nobody cares more about the Black lives in our inner cities than the officers who are out there every day protecting them.
I think it's important to state two things at the outset. And one is the thing that Jason ended with, and that is you can be pro accountability and still be pro law enforcement and respect the really tough and difficult job that these folks have to do. They have a tough job. I do think, though, because of just the hyper partisan times that we live in, however, that in the fact that we have become more accustomed to this us versus them mentality, that thought process has now bled into policing. That it's like you're either pro-police 100% of the time or you're anti-police 100% of the time, and I reject that notion. I am pro law enforcement and making sure that they have the tools and the training that they need in order to be successful and to do the things, frankly, that the community expects them to do. But I'm also pro accountability. And if, working towards the gaps in the system so that there is a transparent, accountable process for dealing with issues, whether that's within the division or the way the division acts with the community and interacts with the community. And I think both of those things can coexist at the same time. And frankly, they must coexist because we need police to handle some really tough assignments that we have in our neighborhoods, to go after some really bad actors who deserve to go to prison, who are terrorizing our neighborhoods, that are, aimlessly shooting at their intended target and wounding 2-year-olds and 60-year-old grandmothers making coffee. These are really, people that are bad people and have, utter disregard for human life. And there needs to be accountability for them. And our law enforcement personnel are the ones in the front line to hopefully identify them and bring them to justice, along with judges and prosecutors. That doesn't mean, however, like I was saying, that there shouldn't be accountability. And it also doesn't mean that there can be a recognition that, like many other aspects of government, aspects of corporate America, that there are systematic, racial barriers in place that are institutional in nature. That doesn't mean that people are racist. That means that there may be policies that have an indirect or direct impact negatively to people of color or to women. And like those are the barriers that we need to identify and break down. And I think, we can, obviously we're here to talk about policing, but it's no different in healthcare, of how COVID is disproportionately impacting people of color compared to white folk. That's because of just institutional, racist, race-based barriers in the healthcare system that over time have disproportionately impacted people of color. It's the same thing in banking and redlining and what we have historically dealt with there. Those were institutional barriers that have a racist effect on people of color. And I do think that police are not immune to the recognition that there may be policies and procedures that have a disproportionate impact on people of color. I know this is something the FOP doesn't directly deal with, but you look at recruiting. We're getting better at recruiting, but our recruit class is not reflective of the community. It's becoming more reflective, and that's a good thing. But we have to ask ourselves, the way we recruit, what are the policies and the procedures and the way we go about things in order to get a diverse recruit class, that is reflective of our community? And are some of the ways that we go about things, like, are those the systematic barriers in place that prevent us from getting a more diverse recruit class? And also the same thing once you're in the division from a promotion standpoint. All of the leadership at the deputy chief level and above are white in the city of Columbus. They're all white. And doesn't mean they're bad people, but it's not reflective of the city of Columbus. So what are the promotion processes in place from once you become an officer all the way up to possibly being the chief of police? Like what are in place along the way that have a disproportionate impact or a negative impact on people of color?
Thanks.
I don't know if there's other people that have questions. That usually we end at 1, I think, Scott, and then that really we have about 8 minutes left. If other people have questions, I just want to make a comment. I'm a lawyer. I'm not a police officer. I've worked for the FOP for about the same time that Jason's been a police officer, almost 30 years. I did a ride along years ago when I first got hired. And, another to me bad side of COVID is I'm sure they've suspended the ride along program right now. But I always encourage my family, my friends, do a ride along. As Zach has said, and Jason, of course, has said he's experienced, you don't know how difficult the job is until you get into a car with a police officer and you go second shift in the, on a 90-degree day and respond to calls. It's a whole different perspective. And when I have friends who are critical of, maybe the work that police do, or I say to them, until you walk in their shoes and get into a car and put yourself out there in grave danger to yourself, it's easy to judge. And I always encourage my colleagues and my friends and my coworkers to do a ride along. Now, maybe when COVID gets resolved and the pandemic is over, that will start again. But that's, I would encourage people to do, because it is a difficult job. And it does give you perspective when you're doing the ride along, which most people don't even know that possibility exists, that you can do a ride along.
If I could add, Gwen, and you're right, we do encourage them right now under COVID. We're not, because of the transmission of the disease. But I will say that for many years, I also, working with the Division of Police, have run a number of, use of force scenarios, shoot, don't shoot, and have taken a number of people, general citizens, General Assembly members, council members, and others, and run them through don't shoot scenarios. Now, you can't fully understand everything, but we spend some prep time going through, the use of force continuum, Graham versus Connor, and then we give you some scenarios and we go through. And it is amazing within one day to watch the progression of the students in the class, how the reactions change from the beginning to the end. And the feedback that we get is phenomenal, always positive about, the environment and the learning that comes with it. So I would offer to COLERA, once COVID is over and or we have the ability to get back to work safely, if anybody here, including Zach, I'm sure would like to do it as well, would like to run through some use of force scenarios, I'd be happy to set it up and spend a day at the training academy and doing some education. It'd be fantastic.
I want to say, you've taken me on this before, Jason.
I'm sorry, Zach, what's that?
We've done this together before.
Yeah. I meant for you to come with us on a journey.
Yeah.
Well, and I did it with Jason, and I think I will certainly not classify myself as a straight shooter. I think I often miss the suspect and hit the victim. So, but look, I think Gwen and I both appreciate that you each have lowered the political rhetoric. You've been very square and straightforward with us, and I'm certainly appreciative that you were kind enough to accept our invitation to come to COLERA today.
Well, again, I thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to work with Zach on whatever the topic may be, and it's my honor to be here in front of everyone.
Yes, I thank you. I agree. And Jason, it's an honor to be on the panel with you, and thank you for including me. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you both. Thank you, Bob and Gwen, for leading a very stimulating conversation. Great job, and hope to see all of you on December 15th.
Thank you.
For the rest of your day.